Hello, and welcome to M4LU, presented by Moms for Liberty. We're here to translate complex topics into more easily understood content, giving you, the parents, grandparents, and every American citizen, the key facts and information you need to empower you to fight back against government overreach, especially as it impacts our kids in schools. Hi, I'm Melissa Karwowski, Program Director of M4LU. Each month, we'll focus on a single topic, ideology, or issue that impacts our kids, schools, and communities. We'll approach it from multiple angles, starting with a 101 intro lecture, followed by a 102 course that goes a little deeper on the topic. If available, we'll do a virtual watch party of a film relating to the topic, and finally culminate with a monthly book club discussion. Best of all, every event will have live Q&A with experts in the field to help us make sense of it all. We understand this can be a lot to digest, but don't worry, we've got your back. You'll find a corresponding toolkit in the resource library at m4lu.org. In addition to recordings of all monthly events, each toolkit will include a curated smart book, presentation slides that can be used at chapter meetings, related white papers, articles, podcasts, and so much more. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Depending on what device you are using, there should be an audience chat and Q&A feature at the right of your screen. Please comment, interact with your fellow audience members, and be sure to submit those questions to our amazing guests. It is so valuable to get this direct interaction with them, so please take advantage of it. As a warning, rude or demeaning comments will get you removed from this event, and you will not be permitted to re-enter. Now, of course, the legal reminder that the opinions of the guests and any media content shared are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of M4LU or Moms for Liberty. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the word and support our mission. We try to keep our resources affordable and accessible to all, but if you would like to donate, please visit m4lu.org. Thank you again. Now let's jump over to the event. Welcome to RJ 102. We are so glad you're here for our second look at restorative justice in the month of March. My name is Missy Karwowski, Director of M4LU, and tonight I'm sitting down with Daniel Buck, an educator and researcher who can personally attest to the negative results of implementing restorative justice in schools. In this continuation of our month-long focus on restorative justice, or RJ, we will discuss the history and origin of RJ, how it infiltrated the schools, some of the terms that it hides behind, and ways that you can fight back. As we go further through the looking glass, you will find that each topic we're covering is intertwined with others and builds on the previous ones. So I strongly encourage you to check out the previous M4LU events covering SEL, CRT, and DEI, which you can find in the resource library at m4lu.org. And with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed guest, Daniel Buck. Daniel Buck is a senior visiting fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. He's an assistant principal at a classical charter school, a former English teacher, and the author of What is Wrong with Our Schools? He earned his master's degree in curriculum and instruction from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, along with bachelor's degrees in English literature and the Spanish language. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, National Affairs, National Review, the New York Post, First Things, and many other publications. Please help me welcome Daniel Buck. Hi, Daniel.
What a great way to start any talk, by knocking out your own headphones. Thank you for the invitation, Melissa. Thank you all for coming out tonight to hear a little bit more about the chaos that's going on in our schools.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this presentation. I know I got a little preview when we talked the other day, and I know this is going to be so helpful for our team. So I will let you take it away.
All right. There's supposed to be some slides showing up. Great. So thank you. I titled this talk Restorative Injustice because restorative justice is not what it claims to be. I have watched too many teachers and so friends leave the profession because the job has become simply unworkable. I have seen too many students in the classroom who just want to learn. Classroom full of kids begging for a little bit of calm and order, but they cannot get it because there are 2 or 3 students in the class who are functionally allowed to do whatever they want, and they act accordingly. I have broken up too many fights in my time. I have smelled marijuana in too many hallways. I have seen too many things that I cannot discuss on a polite call like this happen in a school for me to allow the advocates of restorative justice to have that kind of sleight of hand where they get to claim the moral high ground. What restorative justice really is a grand injustice being foisted upon our schools. So a little bit what we're going to cover today. Discuss restorative justice in action, just some of my own experiences with it, working in schools that have implemented it. Some background of restorative justice, covering definitions, other terms that it may fly under, a brief history, how it's played out in the United States and kind of what is its philosophical roots. Go into some of the research. You'll hear advocates of restorative justice or administrators who support its use say, well, it's backed in the research, but it really isn't. So we're kind of going to pick apart some of the better research that's out there, discuss solutions, and then open it up to question and answer at the end. So restorative justice in action. I worked at what was considered one of the best schools in Milwaukee. It was in arguably the roughest neighborhood, the most violent neighborhood in the city of Milwaukee. If you drive from the burbs down to this neighborhood, you'll pass the Cash for Gold stores and the neighborhoods where there are metal bars on windows, and you will get to about 10 blocks where there are no stores. There's such high crime that no business could function there, and there are no longer bars on windows because all of the buildings are evacuated. All the buildings are abandoned. There's no one left working there, no one left living there. There's nothing left to steal or loot. It's just an abandoned 10 blocks functionally. And that's where this school that I worked at was. Despite all of that context, though, it was considered one of the better schools in the city. It held incredibly high behavioral standards for their students. It used incredibly rigorous curriculum on state standardized test scores. It competed with the affluent schools out in the bougie suburbs. It was an incredible school. You walked in there and students were reading Shakespeare. The hallways were quiet and orderly. Students looked at their teachers and thanked them at the end of class, shook their hand as they walked in. It was everything you would want in a school stuck in this incredibly impoverished neighborhood. And then the administration kind of changed hands. The new administrators decided punitive discipline of any kind, giving kids consequences is oppressive or wrong or counterproductive. So they got rid of them. And within a year or two, the school was unrecognizable. The things that I saw, bathroom sinks ripped off of walls, fecal matter spread on the walls. I broke up fights probably weekly. Once my class, I implemented the consequences that I could. And I had one of the few kind of functional classrooms. It wasn't pretty, but it worked and kids were learning there. And my students were kind of they had some work time. There was a little bit of light chatter, but most of the kids were focused. And a student came into my room and started screaming at the top of her lungs at one of my kids. So this is a student came in from the hallway, started screaming to one of my students in my room who was trying to do her literature work, started screaming at her, "F your dead dad." Unsurprisingly, my own student stood up and was ready to go, ready to throw hands. Myself and a few other students held them back from committing felony assaults. We evacuated the room. The only student who was allowed to stay in the room was the one who came in from the hallway, initiated this conflict. And my administrator came up to me and said, "Well, she's calmed down. She feels bad about what she's done. I mean, she said sorry to me. So we're going to let her stay here. You know, she's going to stay in school today. And this student had to come to my room later in the day. And I said, I will not take her in my room. I do not care what your decision is. I will not let her walk through my classroom doors because it is unsafe for the other 29 students in my classroom to have her in here right now after she tried to do that today. And I looked at my administrator in the face and said, if you do not suspend her today, if you do not communicate to her that this behavior is unacceptable, if you do not communicate to the other students in this building that this behavior is unacceptable, not only will this student who you should suspend, not only will she end up getting expelled because she won't get the message and she'll finally do something that crosses the line, but all of the other students are going to get the message that fighting is okay here, and we're going to have more and more and more and more and more. Unsurprisingly, the rates of fights just got worse throughout the year, and this student did eventually get expelled because she just got so violent that allowing her in the building was untenable. Third of teachers quit that year in the middle of the year. Several teachers were physically threatened, and administration did nothing about it. I mean, I could keep going. A student came into my room, kicked another in the groin. It was a girl, kicked a boy. This boy, he was so nice. He was so sweet. He was always bullied. He didn't do anything wrong to this student. She just thought it would be funny and everyone would laugh if she caused him physical pain. Call the administration. They bring her to their office, and about 5 minutes later, bring her back. She's got a bag of, I don't remember if it was Takis or hot Cheetos. And the admin says to me, well, you know, she didn't have enough. She told us she didn't have enough for breakfast this morning, so she was a little bit grumpy. And that's why she was, you know, acting out. And she said she felt bad about it, so we're going to let her back in. That is what restorative justice means. All of those examples, it means no consequences for the kids who are behaving. It means no consequences for kids who are acting out. It means no consequences for any behavior, be it violent, related to drugs, related to anything. That is restorative justice in action. So we'll cover some transition to kind of the informational part of this talk, just kind of going over some definitions of terms, where in the heck does restorative justice come from, and then move on to the research after that. So restorative justice, I have kind of a definition there. It's an approach to discipline that views authority and consequences as inherently oppressive. According to this theory, misbehavior stems from cultural conflict or unmet needs. So misbehavior warrants a conversation, not punishment. Restorative justice, they claim they're going to restore wrongs by having a conversation between the perpetrator and the victim and coming up with something better to do next time. There is never a detention. There's never a lost recess. There's never any kind of consequence worked into there. All we're going to do is have a conversation to restore justice. Of course, without a consequence, there never is justice. Restorative practices, it's a laundry list of alternatives to traditional discipline and community building. In theory, these practices will create a utopian environment such that no child will ever wish to misbehave. So restorative practices are whatever the speaker wants them to be. It is any activity that builds community in the classroom so that, in theory, every kid feels so welcomed. They have such a sense of belonging. They feel so committed to their fellow students that the idea of acting out or misbehaving would never cross their mind. They care so much about long division because the teacher has sold it to them so well that they would never act out. They would never rob that opportunity for learning from the friend and fellow student next to them. And then positive behavioral interventions and supports, an approach to discipline that emphasizes rewarding good behavior with praise, tickets, or trinkets, and usually just kind of ignoring misbehavior. I have a little time for PBIS, is what it's called for short, just the acronym. I have a little bit of time for it. A good classroom will have some sort of incentive system, some sort of reward system. The problem with PBIS is so often it comes along with deconstructed discipline and a lack of consequences. So if you maintain that traditional discipline and you have a bit of PBIS, that's fine. It's the issue comes if PBIS replaces the other. All of these, what they have in common is they externalize the cause of misbehavior. So traditionally, we would think of behavior stemming from something inside of us. If you go back to St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, they would use something like the word sin. Human beings are imperfect. Christians would call it sin. Because of this broken state of nature in the human heart, we rebel. We break God's law. We're selfish. We're wicked. We're cruel. We're mean. We murder. We commit adultery, all of these kinds of things. But we don't have to rely on Christian terminology to maintain this idea of human imperfection. You can go ahead to the Enlightenment, the thinkers of like John Locke. All human beings in some way are self-interested, not even selfish necessarily, but we think about ourselves first and foremost. And at some point, my interest and my desire is going to come in conflict with somebody else in society. Our self-interest, my desire is eventually going to conflict with your right. The phrases or common phrases, my own right over my hand ends when it meets your right over your own face. We just kind of come into conflict in society. And so we need structures and we need consequences and we need laws to manage those natural conflicts that are going to come up. You could skip ahead a few hundred years after that and talk about natural selection and evolution. There's just some imperfection left in us that causes us to commit crimes, to misbehave when we're kids, to speak cruelly, even to a friend when we're adults. We don't have to rely on the Christian terminology to maintain the idea that people act out because we are imperfect. All of these terms, restorative justice rejects that idea. Restorative justice, PBIS advocates would argue that the cause of misbehavior is external to us. We are great and wonderful and perfect. Our children are little angels. Johnny only acts out because he's hungry. Johnny only acts out because he doesn't get enough hugs at home and he's not loved enough. And so he's not emotionally supported enough. And so he's going to act out. Little Johnny is having a cultural conflict at school and feels like the school is trying to change who he is. And he's rebelling against that oppressive force. And that's why he's choosing to throw a chair, not because he's a 12-year-old boy that just needs a timeout. Of course, this is anyone who has raised a kid or worked in a classroom knows that kids aren't perfect. And that's fine. That's wonderful. None of us are perfect. In fact, that's the whole point of education, is that we are taking the youth, the kids who don't know everything, who need some guidance, some character shaping, and we're going to try and teach them a little bit more, make them a little bit better. The idea that we are imperfect is kind of assumed in education. And if we get rid of that, we get rid of the whole purpose of education. But at this point, I'm going on a bit of a tangent. So next slide. Thank you. Some other watchwords, some are worse than others. Positive discipline, it can mean whatever the speaker wants it to mean. Multi-tier system of supports isn't all bad. You'll usually see it introduced as a triangle. The bottom of the triangle are the behavioral interventions that any kid would need. Even the best kids need to be reminded to stop talking from time to time. Even the best kids might need to be held in for a minute before they're released to go to recess to have a brief conversation with the teacher, so that the multi-tier, the bottom tier, is what every kid needs, pretty easy to implement. A middle tier would be kind of semi-intrusive interventions. So a kid might have a more intense incentive system, like a point system, where once they get enough points for not talking or remembering to turn in their homework or bringing all of their supplies to class, eventually they can win some sort of trinket, an extra privilege, and they also get extra consequences. And then the top tier, the bottom tier, it's the most students, the middle tier, probably 10 to 15%, and the top tier is, the 1% of most difficult students that might need something like an alternative placement, an additional teacher in the classroom, some sort of really intensive intervention to get them behaving. Restorative discipline, just another way to say restorative justice. Relationship-focused discipline, to some extent, all discipline depends on relationships, but the best discipline depends on the teacher being the authority in the room and the student being a student. When you see relationship-focused discipline, usually what that means, advocates are suggesting teachers should be kind of chummy and buddy-buddy with their students, which doesn't work. Love and logic maintains some amount of consequences and discipline. My one quibble with it is they argue that consequences should always match the crime. So if a student draws all over a desk, they should then clean up the desk and maybe a few more. I think that's a good use, so long as there might be, it matches the crime and then something else. What consequences do are two things. They communicate to the other students, don't do this. This is unacceptable here, and we are going to protect your learning from this behavior that's distracting from your learning. The second thing it does is it creates a disincentive from doing that behavior. If a student knows, lunch detention is one of the classic punishments or consequences. If a student knows, if I draw on this desk, not only am I going to have to clean it off, but I miss the chance to go hang out and talk with my friends at lunch, maybe it's not worth writing on the desk. So I like love and logic so long as you kind of have that corrective action plus some other disincentive like missing lunch. Progressive discipline, I think a lot of us, whenever we see progressive used in education, it kind of makes our hackles stand up. But progressive discipline is actually, if it's used in its strict definition, is a good thing. All it means is that consequences have to progress up. So you might start with something really, really small, miss a minute of recess to talk with the teacher, then you build up to miss 10 minutes of recess, then it's a lunch detention, then it's an after-school detention, then it's a Saturday detention, then it's out of school suspension, and the student's not allowed back in until the parent has to come in and have a conference. The progressive discipline means the consequences progress upwards, and even a small action like talking out of turn, if it continues and doesn't change itself, can kind of progress up that ladder. Because students come home and say, they gave me a detention because I was talking out of turn. Not usually the case. What it is they were talking out of turn constantly and doing it for weeks to the point where a teacher couldn't teach the lesson, right? What might be a seemingly small misbehavior can actually build to something big if it lasts throughout the course of a quarter or semester and is ongoing. So progressive discipline just means you need to have this building structure of consequences that goes up and up and up and up. Next slide. One specific thing I want to talk about in my defining terms, this is one of those restorative practices that's really common, this idea that we're going to create like a kumbaya classroom where kids never want to misbehave. Restorative circles, they work. So what they do, teachers will put the classroom in a circle. There might be scattered on the ground sheets of paper that kind of have encouraging words on them. There's a talking piece that's passed around, and only the person who's holding the talking piece gets to talk. We did a lot of these when I was in my teacher prep program. Some of the talking pieces were a popsicle stick with googly eyes. One of the master students, like this is a graduate student, brought in one of their childhood stuffed animals, and we passed that one around. Black Lives Matter friendship bracelet. It is whoever has the talking piece, they're the one who's allowed to talk. It often begins with some sort of meditative gong. Restorative circles find their history in kind of Native American spirituality and New Age religions. Right? There's no religion allowed in schools, but that only applies to Christianity and Judaism. Apologize for that aside, but it has kind of this New Age spirituality roots into it. But they get in a circle, they pass around this talking piece, and then here's some of the kinds of questions that they discuss. So recommended restorative circle questions. This is from a guide posted in Edutopia, this really popular teacher resource. How does the state of your mental health affect you as a person? What do you do to relieve stress? Who would you like to forgive? Flip over to the black box. These are questions recommended for counselors, just kind of a question bank for counselors to consider if they're stuck with a patient and need to try and move in a new direction. How do you think your negative thoughts influence your behavior? What are some of the things that make you feel stressed, and how are you coping with these things? Is there anyone in your life you're struggling to forgive, and why? What I'm trying to show here is that restorative circles are glorified group therapy playing out in a classroom. And there are some problems with this. The American Psychological Association has this big, long document of ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct. And there are a number that these restorative circles run afoul of, but I'm going to cover just 3 of them. The first one, the first breach of this code of conduct. Psychologists should only provide services, teach, and conduct research within the boundaries of their competence. So somebody trained in pediatric psychology should not, on a whim, take on a whole practice trying to help fentanyl addicts cope with their addiction. It's just not what they're trained in, and they could actually do more damage than help if they're kind of acting outside of their expertise. Now, teachers, when they got any child psychology, it was probably one course in undergrad that they slept through. It is not enough training to handle the kind of volatile emotions that would come out when you're asking questions like, who in your life do you need to forgive, or who are you hoping for forgiveness for? It's not their training. It's not my training. My training is how to run a classroom of 20 to 30 kids, teach them the basics of reading, teach them new vocabulary and grammar, maintain order with a group of children. That's my training, not psychotherapy where I'm opening up their deepest hurts and performing kind of emotional surgery on them. That would be incredibly unethical and I think almost dangerous for me to do. Breach 2, counselors are strongly advised against multiple relationships. If you are a therapist or a counselor to somebody, that is the only relationship you should have to them. When you're getting all of this personal information, it creates a unique power dynamic between counselor and counselee. You wouldn't want the person who knows all of your deepest, darkest secrets also making employment decisions or payment decisions about you. It just gets really messy, really, really fast. And teachers, they have to grade them, they have to dole out consequences. All sorts of ethical concerns could come up quickly if you're trying to mix this therapeutic and this educative role. Then breach 3, psychologists, honestly, any doctors giving any kind of curative intervention have to have informed consent, saying, here's what we're going to do. Here are the potential consequences. Here are the potential trade-offs. Do you consent, or do you have a right to revoke any kind of medical care so long as you're in your right mind? But these restorative circles, these glorified counseling sessions, kids don't consent to them. In fact, they're kind of compelled into them. They probably are sitting there worrying they're going to get a bad grade if they don't participate. Parents aren't told that they're happening, or if they are, they don't know the extent of them. There's just no informed consent here. I turned against these when I was in my teacher prep program, when I was student teaching. Again, many of my classes were run on these restorative circles, and they would throw out the day's content because something in the news offended them, or perhaps Trump said something that they didn't like, and we had to take 45 minutes of our day to pass around a popsicle stick with googly eyes and talk about how it traumatized us. But that's a story for another day. The story I'm telling today is when I was in a classroom, I was encouraged to run some of these as a student teacher. My cooperating teacher, kind of the guy who was training me, wasn't there for that day. So I said, haha, now's my chance. And I opened it up. I don't even remember the questions that I asked, but there was a student who was bullied pretty viciously throughout the year. And he had had enough, and he saw no other option. And he finally, he got the talking piece, and he said, because of what I'm facing here, I've considered suicide before. And this is in the presence of his classmates. This is in the presence of his bullies. And the only adult there to manage this situation was a 21-year-old dope who thought it would be a good idea to run this. That was incredibly risky. I regret doing it. I didn't know any better. But that kid's situation, it wasn't fixed because the school used restorative justice. So these bullies, they'd come in, give a ham-fisted, faked apology, show contrition, great actors, and then they just go back to doing what they did. And now there's a risk that they're going to use this confession of this bullied student as, weaponize it against him. Are the other students going to ostracize him anymore? Because this isn't a therapeutic setting where these are honestly often strangers coming together with a trained counselor to discuss all of these really volatile emotions, really sensitive and raw things from our lives. And then they go off and they don't really know each other. It's not that therapeutic setting in the classroom, and these restorative circles just have no place there. They're incredibly unethical, and the sooner this fad stops, the better for all of our students involved. So we're going to get into a bit of a brief kind of ideological history. Where in the world does this restorative justice come from? It really has its roots in European Romanticism. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You might remember him from your European history or civics class. He has this pithy phrase that kind of summarizes European Romanticism. He says, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." It's the opening sentence to the social contract. And what that phrase really means is human beings are perfect. We have this spark of divine within us. But society comes in and is what corrupts us and what makes us act criminally. It's what depresses us. It's what makes us feel anxious. We need to just get away from society back to a state of nature. Sound familiar a bit with restorative justice? Love to ask Rousseau, if we were all so perfect, why did we make an imperfect society? But he's deceased, so I can't ask him this question. He wrote this canonical book on education called Emile, or On Education. It's like 600 pages long. I would not recommend reading it. In the book, he is giving advice to a young mother. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had, I believe, 5 children out of wedlock and put them all in an orphanage. So why he thinks he's has the experience to give any kind of parenting or child rearing advice, left to the imagination, but he does anyways. His argument is essentially, we need to just take our students away from society, away from adults, away from rules, away from any kind of strictures or authority, and just let them be. They have everything that they need. And so if we just let them be, learn what they want, make their own mistakes, like a plant, if we just leave them, they will kind of grow into exactly what they need. This romantic view of human nature turned radical in the 1960s. Before that, actually, at the turn of the 20th century, so in about the 1910s, 1920s, the progressives and the romantics founded a bunch of schools of education. They trained all of the teachers, and this progressive romantic view of humanity became the mainstream belief in American education because that's what teachers were trained into. And then this view turned radical in the 1960s with this, it was called critical pedagogy or critical theory. The Pedagogy of the Oppressed is one of the single most assigned books in schools of education. If you ask any teacher about the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, they've heard of it. Many of them have probably read it because it's one of the most assigned books in schools of education, in teacher prep programs. And it is an explicitly Marxist text that extends that romantic view of human nature into something radical. So not only are we perfect and need to get away from society, no. We are perfect and we need to turn our anger onto society itself and deconstruct it, get rid of these oppressive structures, tear it all down. Paulo Freire, the guy that wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in this book argues that it is the role of teachers to train students to be activists, to stir up this kind of proletarian discontent, show them the oppressions in the world so that they can go change it and bring about a Marxist utopia. There's this joke from South Park that this kind of reminds me from. Stick with me for a second. There are gnomes that are stealing socks and clothing from people. They ask the gnomes, why are you stealing this clothing? And they have a 3-step process. They say, step 1, steal the clothing. Step 2 is a bunch of question marks. And then step 3 is profit. And Paulo Freire and the Marxists, it's step 1, tear down all of the oppressive structures. Step 2, a bunch of question marks. Step 3, Marxist utopia where no one has to work ever again. I can hear myself and I sound like a crazy person talking about this. But again, you can look the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, Education Next, the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. There have been several academic reviews of the curricula of schools of education. And this is, if not the first, the second, the third most assigned book that teachers read when they're being trained to be teachers. It is, if I'm not mistaken, the third most cited book in all of social science. It's this wildly influential book that too few people have heard about. So this critical theory then bleeds into everything that we're seeing in education. Diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory, restorative justice, social emotional learning. It's the same root that schools exist to question and deconstruct the oppressive structures in society. If it's discipline codes, if it's our own state of mental health, if it's race relation, whatever it is, that fundamental belief is playing out in all of these other buzzwords. Restorative justice, critical race theory, DEI, social emotional learning. They are different. They are their own discrete ideas, but they have the same roots. So there's some errors in this thinking. Obviously, nobody's perfect. We could create a perfect society, a perfect classroom, and still conversations would get catty. Boys would talk out of turn and make crude jokes. Fights would break out because Kant wrote a great quote, "From the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing has ever been made." Nobody's perfect. And so we need structures set up to kind of curtail and keep in check that imperfection. We cannot solve misbehavior. Kids are always going to act out because they're kids. And adult humans are always going to commit crimes because we're human. It is what we do. We cannot solve misbehavior. The best we can do is kind of disincentivize it and set up structures to react to it when it does happen. Discipline and authority are good things. These often are now treated as dirty words. They are not. Kids want to walk into a classroom and know that they're going to be able to learn. Kids are going to walk into a classroom and want to know that they are going to be safe. They want to have a sense that the adult in the room is in charge. They crave that safety and order. I've had many students come up to me and thank me for making kids be silent, work silently. When you're a new teacher, it's really uncomfortable to say you're going to work silently because I say so. But then you have kids come up to you where they might be from chaotic homes. The bus is full of cussing and fighting. The lunchroom is chaos. And they love that 20 minutes in your class where they just have a moment to sit in silence. Discipline works. It does. I see it with my own daughter. If I tell her not to do something, I tell her not to do something, I tell her not to do something, she just keeps doing it until she gets some sort of consequence. She loses a toy, she gets a timeout, whatever it is. And then underlying behavior explains disparities. So there are disparities in rates of discipline between all races, also socioeconomic, demographics. But there are underlying differences in behavior that result in this. African American students on surveys admit to using drugs in school more often, bringing weapons to school more often, picking fights more often. It has nothing to do with their skin color. We can look at things like rates of single parent household, socioeconomic status, the general socioeconomic status between white and black families, the presence of lead pipes in cities versus suburbs. There are lots of other causes for this. It has nothing to do with the color of the skin. And also, there are differing rates of misbehavior between all demographics. And that explains disparities, not racist teachers or racist oppressive structures. So the modern era, I'm kind of running along here, so I'll speed through some of the modern era. Long story short, for decades, there was a conflict between discipline reformers and discipline hawks like myself. Obama put out a Dear Colleague letter threatening schools with lawsuits if there were racial disparities in rates of punishment. So schools had no option but to adopt things like PBIS or restorative justice. The discipline hawks kind of lost a bit of ground. And then after the George Floyd summer, all of districts across the country basically put out these Maoist-like mea culpas, and the reformers just ran full ahead because there was no one to fight back, no one with the spine to stand up and say, no, actually detentions and consequences are good for kids in schools. This can be tracked with the decline and fall of charter schools, KIPP and uncommon schools. They've been termed no excuse schools. It means no excuse for the adults. There was no excuse to let these kids fail. But they were known for these incredibly high behavioral standards, silence in the hallways. Kids would get, demerits for mismatched socks, things like this. But they blew the competition out of the water. They were incredibly successful. But after the George Floyd summer, they all kind of renounced their commitment to high discipline, and now they resemble your run-of-the-mill, chaotic, traditional public school. State of affairs across the country, discipline and behavior is off the chain. So rates of verbal and physical harassment, both between students and from student, there's a typo there. Basically, rates of violence between students and from student to teacher, and verbal harassment between students and from student to teacher have doubled. That's what is on the left. Those bar graphs are just showing the rate doubling from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. This is according to a survey of thousands of teachers and administrators. And then that's the abstract to a brief from an American Psychological Association survey showing a significant spike in misbehavior pre and post-pandemic. This is not just old men being grouchy, saying schools aren't like they were when I was a kid. There is a measurable increase in misbehavior in schools. The research. Does restorative justice work? Does PBIS work? Newsflash, no, it doesn't. Next slide. Yeah. Here are 3 academic studies that look into it. Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, they all made a commitment to roll back their reliance on any kind of punitive discipline, and in particular, suspensions. Every time it's tried, outcomes devolve. Truancy rates go up, math scores go down, reading scores go down, teacher retention plummets, so all the teachers quit because their jobs are terrible. Classroom disruptions increase, egregious behaviors increase, so those are like fights, drugs in the bathroom, those kinds of things. GPAs plummet, and ironically, even time out of school due to suspensions usually goes up. They stop suspending kids for minor misbehaviors, the half day of in-school suspension for disrespecting their teacher or refusing to follow a direction, and instead they're getting now 5 days of suspension because they brought a knife to school. And there are more of these egregious behaviors, so kids end up spending far more time out of the class because schools stopped suspending kids for minor things or stopped giving punishments for minor things. The dark irony of this all is that restorative justice is implemented to theoretically help the students that are most in need, but the schools that suffer most from the consequences of restorative justice are the poor and impoverished schools. So it does no student any good if they're saved from a suspension, but the school that they are then shoved into is full of violence, chaos, and drugs. PBIS, there's a little bit of research that finds positive effects, but it exists only within elementary school settings, and traditional discipline structures still exist. So again, PBIS focuses on rewarding the positive behavior. When I was still in the classroom, I had an incentive system where I would kind of keep track of positive behaviors behind the scenes. I would reward kids points, and then on Friday they could buy, a ticket to sit in a comfy chair for the day, to sit where they wanted during lunch, to get 3 points of extra credit, those kinds of things. So PBIS, there's some research that it still works, but only for younger students, and only when schools maintain their traditional discipline structures. What's the consensus? Even discipline hawks like myself, like I am a discipline hawk, none of us would suggest that we shouldn't have some sort of positive reward system in schools, some sort of incentive system. None of us would suggest that after a kid misbehaves, we shouldn't have a follow-up conversation with them, right? What did you do wrong? What can you do differently next time? How can you make it better? Should you apologize? What can you do to help yourself calm down if you feel you're getting angry? Like, these are things that just any smart teacher, any halfway competent teacher is going to do. They are going to implement aspects of PBIS or restorative justice or any of these other buzzwords, multi-tiered systems of supports, right? They're going to focus on some kids more than others when it comes to behavioral correction. These are things that normal competent teachers do. The problem is when, in seeking out restorative conversations or positive incentives or multi-tiered systems of support, we get rid of all of the consequences. It is all of these additional things, they're additional, but they can only function when you have that fundamental, primary, rigid structure that keeps a school secure. It's almost like, gutters and shingles and window dressings on a house. That's all that extra stuff. It's not going to keep the rain out, though, if you don't have the walls and the roof. The walls and the roof are essential, and then you can add on all of these additional things. What teachers think, they hate it. They really do. Next slide. So just a few surveys. I talked to 200 teachers over the course of a few weeks. Once I just put out an ask for teachers. I have a large following on Twitter, and I just put out an ask for teachers to tell me what frustrates them. I got 200 teachers sending me individual messages, and just messaged back, and spent basically 2 weeks of my life just talking to teachers back and forth. Every single one of them talked about discipline as the biggest pain in their tuchus. My organization, Fordham Institute, ran more of an academic, representative survey, discipline reform through the eyes of teachers, and all of them thought schools were too lenient. Even at bottom right, the circles, that's an internal union survey. Basically, what is making teachers consider quitting? Stress and student behavior were tied for number one. To many people's surprise, lack of pay was not the number one reason, and that is the case across surveys. There are many, many more like this that find discipline beats out pay for the number one concern of teachers. Restorative justice is very much what we would call a, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the term. It's a privileged belief. It's a luxury belief. That's the term I'm looking for. Luxury belief. A phrase coined by Ryan Henderson, this idea that there are certain beliefs that if you live a privileged life and in affluence, you can hold these beliefs. Abolish the police is another example. If you live out in the suburbs, you can hold up a placard and chant abolish the police because you don't have to deal with the consequences of those policies. You don't have to deal with the increase in crime, the broken windows, all of these kinds of things. It's a luxury belief. Discipline reform is one of these luxury beliefs. Professors and activists who don't have to go into a classroom and deal with the chaos can feel good about themselves while teachers and students suffer. Now what? Coming up to the end here. Teachers implement the consequences that you can. At this school that I worked at that was great and kind of fell from grace, my principal asked me once, Buck, how do you keep your classroom in order? How do you build those relationships to keep your classroom in order? And this was impromptu at a staff meeting. And I said, it has nothing to do with relationships. It's the fact that I keep them from gym. I keep them from lunch. I keep them from recess and implement my own detentions. I made almost 200 parent phone calls that year. I implemented my own consequences where the administration didn't. Parents make noise. Administrators are notorious for having the backbone of a wet noodle, and whoever is pressuring them, that is who they are going to cave to. So if the only parents making a ruckus are the ones saying that my little Johnny can do no wrong, how dare you give him a lunch detention, that administrator is going to then lean towards leniency. Conversely, if parents start making a fuss because their kid can't focus because there's these 3 boys that are constantly making farting noises in the back of class, starting fights at recess, bullying kids, why aren't you punishing them? Why aren't you giving them consequences? Why are you letting them get away with this? You don't even have to really make any real threats of like lawsuit or action. Just make a ruckus, make a stink of any kind, go to board meetings. And then we suddenly have this counter pressure fighting back and forth. Votes, I live in a blue area, just still in Milwaukee County. And even here, all the school board candidates are making, both the right-coded and left-coded ones are kind of making discipline a part of their platform because they know if they don't, they're going to get voted out. And just learn more about restorative justice and discipline so you can kind of make a coherent, cogent argument when confronted. School boards, whole lot you can do. This is really where the power is. You can compel principals to act. The Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty has this great model policy that essentially says principals cannot return a student kicked out of class until they have implemented some sort of consequence. Principals have to act before they send a student back to class. Require behavioral audits and reviews. A few districts have opened up anonymous surveys for teachers where they can kind of tell the stories, and they are haunting. Lines like, there would be no consequence unless blood was spilled, was a quote from one of these. And if a school board member or state superintendent is going to try and pick the discipline fight, they need rhetorical cover in the media, and these stories of chaos are going to kind of fight back against the progressive activists making whatever case that they're making. Tighten up discipline handbooks. So go through, make sure administrators are empowered and have the ability to give out consequences for just about any behavior. They're kind of the policy that either gives the administrator teeth or strips them of power. And then behavioral transparency. That's the same thing with the audits and reviews. Just make it clear to parents just how much misbehavior there is in schools. Some rhetorical terms. Restorative justice sounds really nice, so it can be hard to argue against. Some strategies for it. Focus on the other 29 students in the class. Advocates of restorative justice are always going to focus on the one victim. How can you rob this student of their right to an education by kicking them out of school? You want to keep learning from them? How could you, you monster? But if you focus on the 29 other kids in the class And you say, well, that kid brought a weapon. Don't those 29 other kids deserve safety? Don't those 29 other kids deserve the ability to actually learn the class content so they can go on to college and become successful? I found the phrase tough love has been really, really helpful. The idea that we've lost the idea of tough love. Restorative justice advocates try to claim the mantle of compassion, this idea that loving children or showing care to students just means being permissive all the time and always feeling feelings with them versus saying, that was inappropriate. I expect better than you. You're going to go sit out because I expect better from you. And next time you're going to do better. And I believe that you will because you can. Here's a pound it. Go sit down, go have fun again in 5 minutes, right? There's tough love there that raises students up. And we used to understand that kids needed that and benefited from that. I think we've all had those tough teachers that their classes weren't always enjoyable or weren't always fun, but they made us better because the teachers push us. And then specific examples, plenty exist in the media of, skulls cracked on concrete. And it's like, shouldn't we expel that kid? Shouldn't we suspend that kid for causing permanent brain damage? Seems pretty reasonable to me. And that's what I have.
Wow, thank you. That was such a good presentation. You covered so much information, and I know I learned an absolute ton from there. So thank you so much. I'm going to open it up now to the questions from the audience, which I'm really excited about. As a reminder, everyone, please take advantage of the ask something, the actual Q&A feature, not just posting a regular chat. And then please type your questions in a format that we can display on screen for everyone to read. Okay. And so do we have our first question? Do you believe society is at fault or the individual who committed the transgression? Individual responsibility versus collective responsibility.
I mean, I think it changes as students age. If a kindergartner is completely out of control, it's really hard to blame a 5-year-old for that kind of behavior. Often, it might be just the home that they're from. They weren't taught. So there it's kind of on the parents. But by the time you get to 18, you have to empower students with agency. If we say, well, society is always at fault, we completely strip humanity of free will. You strip students of agency and the idea that they can do better. And there's always some amount of individual will and societal fault. Restorative justice, though, goes entirely into societal fault and makes us all just cogs and whims who don't have any control over our own behavior. And I just reject that view entirely, and also think in practical terms, it doesn't work in a classroom because students need to be given that tough love that says, no, you can do better. You can make better choices. You will. And often when you pressure them that way and speak to them that way and give them consequences, they do.
I love that you highlight agency, the importance of agency, because I think that helps kids to feel better about themselves. Also, one of the biggest takeaways I had earlier was not that not all parts of this are bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that younger kids, like some of that is appropriate for
Yeah.
younger kids because it changes as they age.
Yeah. And I wanted something I didn't get into in the talk, but um, consequences communicate to students that you can do better, that we think better of you, that you are able to do better, that you have the will and ability to do better. No consequences communicate to kids, I don't expect any better from you. You're going to be this way, so why even put in the effort to try and help you?
Ooh, wow. That's that's hard hitting. I love it. All right, do we have another question? I know we do. I saw some really good questions in the chat. How has the access to social media by minors impacted the behavior of students in schools?
undoubtedly made it worse.
Yeah.
I had students planning their fights on Instagram the night before or the morning of. There are a lot of things that are causing kind of the increase of misbehavior in schools. Social media, phone screens, definitely one of them. Closing schools for a year and a half. And so communicating to kids, maybe school isn't that important. We as a society said you didn't need to show up for a year and a half. Um, they kind of lost a lot of that school training and the routines and rules. Trends in gentle parenting. There are a lot of things that are causing the increase in misbehavior, but schools can't make better parents. Schools can't necessarily change the home life. I focus on discipline in schools because it's what schools can control. And when schools do it well, they can maintain order. They can kind of lift kids above their circumstances and background. So yeah, phones cause a lot of it, but just in my role as an administrator and kind of a policy fellow, I focus on education and what schools can do about it, just because that's the focus of my research.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any suggestions that was really surprising that you said that a lot of times you would see students planning fights on Instagram? Is there a way that parents could be monitoring that to, or other people to report something like that?
I mean, we usually found out about it because kids came and told
Kids would
us about
report.
it. Yeah,
That's good.
most kids don't want that happening in schools. I had students come up to me, one student come up to me and say, Mr. Buck, this used to be a good school. And he just walked away. He just had to express kind of that sadness and grief that he knew this school used to be great. But you still have students like that kind of come and report it to you. And so you can intervene. I mean, my recommendation is just get your kids off screens as much as possible. It's countercultural, but we go on long car rides and our kids don't have screens. We don't bring them to restaurants. If we're looking at a screen, we're watching a family movie all together.
Awesome. I think that's really important.
And schools should ban them too, bell to bell.
There's a lot of conversation about that. That's for sure. Okay, our next question. Are schools actually writing restorative justice into the policies and handbooks, or do things still stay the old discipline codes, but RJ is what they are actually doing?
A bit of both. A lot of schools are writing it into their codes. A lot of them have behavior structures still that the admin just ignore. And there's also a lot of state policy too. You
Mm.
know, it was in Nevada, schools have to come up with these really intensive, labor sucking, time sucking restorative justice plans that they have to implement for weeks or months before they can suspend or give any kid a consequence. And that was state policy. Um, uh, California, no, and Illinois and New York, I believe, no longer allow suspensions for willful defiance. So a teacher says, do this, and the kid says, no, and does something exactly opposite, which is kind of the root of the point of teacher authority, is they need to have some sort of their word is law within reason, or else you can't run a classroom. So yeah, it's all of the above.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know when I checked my school district's code of conduct, it was right there. MTSS didn't say anything about restorative justice per se, so I'm really glad you highlighted those other terms.
Mm-hmm.
But the multi-tiered, it was exactly all spelled out.
Yeah, they also changed the severity of consequences allowed for various actions. It was in Akron, Ohio.
Mhm.
There's a union walkout over this, so it didn't pass. But they were going to change. Um, I don't remember if it was expulsion or like a 3-day suspension. They changed from physical assault to physical injury. So they would only dole out this their severest consequence if somebody was actually injured. So it didn't matter if a kid, a bully just on a whim decided to pummel the kid getting bullied on the playground, only if he, broke a femur or something.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, they'll
That's
change the discipline codes even if they don't implement full restorative justice.
That's awful. Do we have another question we can put up? This one I saw before is very good. What age groups are restorative circles used in?
Yes, all of them.
Yeah, I know. Actually, I'll recommend to our audience that if you go check out I think it was the SEL 101, they were talking about this a little bit as well there. And I was surprised to hear it at such a young age that they introduce it very, very young. But then I also don't I have a hard time seeing this being effective to high schoolers.
Oh, I think that's often where it's the most effective because they have the most understanding of whatever trauma is in their lives. Kindergartners don't quite have the verbiage. They're not there to talk about it. If it is at the younger ages, it's usually more whimsical questions to kind of set up the routine. So as they get older, it's just the norm for them. They don't think anything of it when you start switching from what's one thing you did this weekend to what's the most traumatic thing you've seen in your life. Let's discuss that.
Yeah, which that is definitely talk about an invasion of privacy. That is awful thing to be exposing in such a public place. Yeah. I think we saw some people in the chat were saying that they saw it at their high school as well. Can we have another question? Let's see. We've got you have also said that the 4-day school week movement trend is a sign that the government school system has just given up. Do you have any data or statistics to back up this claim?
Yes, not readily on hand though. I think to no one's surprise, schools that have gone to the 4-day week, it doesn't help teacher retention. It doesn't help academic scores. It doesn't help with anything. I'm fine. He's asking about a separate post that I made on social media.
Yeah.
There are like micro schools and not alternative schools, but new school models that kind of blend schooling and homeschooling. There's a school near me that it's 3 days a week in person, 2 days a week at home, and the parents are expected to teach a specific curriculum and specific things. So it's a partnership between a I believe it's a private school and home. That's one thing. That big fan of that. Who has two thumbs and loves school choice? This guy. Let's see some new models. But schools just saying we're going to do 4 days a week because we don't really feel like doing 5 days a week anymore. That doesn't work. There has been some research that's come out in the past few years. I don't have it on the tips of my fingers, but if you reach out to me individually on Twitter, or I think you can get to my email through the Fordham Institute website, I can help you find it there.
That is, I'm going to make sure that we cover how people can follow you when we get to the end. I think we have time for one more question. So let's see, what do we have? What else could we address while we still have you here? Do you believe that rules being broken are a sign the system has failed the transgressor?
No. I think any rule that we set up is going to be broken. It's a
Feels like it's
very,
just human nature.
yeah, that's a very, again, restorative justice framing. The idea that um, if there is a transgression of some kind, because the cause is external, the proper response is to deconstruct and remake the oppressive system. Maybe we need a new curriculum. Maybe we need better policies and procedures. Maybe we need a new teacher. The teacher's got a bunch of implicit bias, whatever it is. That's a very restorative justice framing where the cause is external. And so if a kid has misbehaved, rather than looking at the kid and saying, why did you do that? We look at the school or the teacher or the parent and say, why did you cause little Johnny to act out? Which is just the wrong response to misbehavior.
I agree. I think you really hit the nail on the head too, that it is ultimately so socialist, it's Marxist at the root of oppressor and oppressed, and
Mm-hmm.
deconstruct what we have established and rebuild. Which I think one of the titles or one of the terms we've heard it used is transformative instruction. And I keep hearing that flow through that transforming society. So it seems like it's just another way that they're trying. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, audience members, for joining in and submitting your questions. This was really fantastic. I know I have a ton of takeaways. I've taken so many notes. It's really, really awesome. Before we close, just like I said before, can you please let everyone know where they can follow you and find you, and any final thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I'm most easily findable on Twitter X at Mr. Daniel Buck. I write for the Fordham Institute and National Review the most, but I mean, if you look at my name, I've written just kind of all over the place. And my book is What is Wrong with Our Schools, published through John Catt Educational on Amazon.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. That was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And that concludes RJ 102. So thanks, audience, again for joining us. We hope this discussion has been useful to you and that you will continue learning more about restorative justice with us as we continue in the month of March. Next week, don't miss our virtual online screening. We'll be watching Echoes of Columbine, so be sure to tune in because directly after the film, you'll be able to ask questions of Frank DeAngelis, who was the Columbine principal. Lastly, on March 25th, impactful book that he co-authored with Max Eden, Why Meadow Died. Of course, if you want to be an expert on the issues, you do need to read the book. But why read it alone when you can read it with friends? If you would like to come on screen and ask a question directly of Mr. Pollock, please email bookclub@momsforliberty.org. That's all one word, bookclub@momsforliberty.org. So just send it in the week prior to the event, so anytime next week. Links to all of our events can be found at m4lu.org. And just a reminder, this has been recorded and it will be posted to the online RJ Toolkit in the M4LU resource library, again at m4lu.org. You can access it anytime. Please continue to follow M4LU as we have quite a lineup for the 2025 spring and fall semesters. And if you would like to support M4LU, please share our resources with friends and family. And if you feel so inclined, please donate to support this program at m4lu.org. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate having you all here. As was famously said by James Madison, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty. And that is the mission of M4LU. Have a great night, everyone.